Understanding the Bible is more than just reading it. In fact, many times simple reading of the Bible can leave us more confused about what exactly is being said. To truly understand the Bible, a little bit of history of the times, when it was written, can give a lot of clarity as to what is being implied, so that we are not totally confused after reading it. This site tries to fulfill the requirement for those who are really interested in understanding the Bible. Hi friends and welcome back. It's nice to see the interest I seem to have generated in you with regards to understanding the Bible. Last week I spoke about the scribes and Pharisees, the Sadducees, the rich and the poor. Today I will be talking about the tax collectors and the prostitutes and about the Samaritans. So let's get started.
The prostitutes.
Not all prostitutes were considered as outcasts prior to Roman occupation. The Old Testament describes two types of prostitutes. There were temple prostitutes or cult prostitutes who were associated with certain types of non-Jewish beliefs. They performed sexual acts as part of worship with the followers of their cult. This is what is spoken of in Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 17 to 18.
No Israelite man or woman is to become a shrine prostitute. You must not bring the earnings of a female prostitute or of a male prostitute into the house of the Lord your God, to pay any vow. The Lord your God detests them both.
The other type of prostitutes were those who had become prostitutes as a means of livelihood because they were unable to get any other source of income. This is spoken of in Proverbs chapter 6 verse 26.
For a prostitute's fee is only a loaf of bread.
Their income were very low since people looked down on the men who visited them. We read about this in Proverbs chapter 6. Hence it was only the travelers or widowers who tended to visit prostitutes. So women turned to this profession only if they were left with no other choice. These type of prostitutes were few in number prior to the Roman occupation of Israel. Now let us look at how the prostitutes were treated in the Old Testament. In 1 Kings chapter 3, we see that prostitutes could approach the king for justice just like any other citizen and could expect to be heard. In Joshua chapter 2 we read of the prostitute named Rahab, who lived outside of Jericho. She helps the Israelites conquer the land, and in return, Joshua ensures that she and her family are protected and not harmed during the siege of Jericho. She later marries an Israelite from the tribe of Judah called Salmon, and gave birth to Boaz. She is thus among the ancestors of King David. In Hosea chapter 1 we read of a prostitute named Gomer to whom God asks the prophet Hosea to get married to. Thus we see that prostitutes, in the Old Testament period, went about in society just like any other citizen. So when did the prostitutes become outcasts? During the Roman occupation of Israel, the Roman soldiers who were mostly unmarried and far from home needed a source of entertainment. They also had a good income and did not mind spending this on prostitutes. The Pharisees watched as the once poor prostitutes became wealthy and influential because of their association with the Romans. They feared this change, because this newfound power of the prostitutes was out of their influence and control. They thus used their influence among the people to categorize these sections of society as sinners and outcasts. They preached that anyone who associated with them would also share their fate. Thus, it was at the time of Jesus that prostitutes began to be treated as outcasts. So is the Catholic religion condoning or accepting prostitution? Not at all. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 16, St. Paul states,
Do you not know that whoever is united to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For it is said, the two shall be one flesh.
So while it would not be considered wrong to marry a prostitute, a temporary union is not accepted by the Church, and this is also true for any temporary relationships, outside of marriage, that the world today seems to have accepted without question.
The tax collectors.
During the time of Jesus, in the 1st century AD, Rome collected direct taxes from the people in the colonies they ruled. These taxes fell under two heads, the poll tax, and the income tax. The poll tax was a fixed amount per individual which was to be paid by every adult person who was not a Roman citizen. This was based on the census, and it was difficult to escape from paying this tax. The income tax was collected from traders, based on their daily collection, and from landowners, based on the income earned from the harvest. The amount collected was a flat 1% of whatever revenue was earned. The Jews also had to pay taxes and tithes to the temple as per the laws of Moses. This was used for the maintenance of the temple. The temple initially collected taxes after every census. However, by the 1st century, they were collected every year. This amount was only half a shekel for every adult. The tithe, however, was 1/10 or 10% of whatever was earned. Thus, the Jews had to pay tithes to the temple as well as income tax to the Romans. This amounted to double taxing, and there was a reluctance on the part of the Jewish traders to pay. The Pharisees also preached that the collection of taxes by the Romans was not in accordance with God's law and that God would not consider it wrong on the part of the Jews, if they did not pay the Romans. Jesus, however, does not agree with this view, and the Gospel tells us of how Jesus responds to this, when questioned by the Pharisees. We see this in Matthew chapter 22 verses 15 to 21, Mark chapter 12 verses 14 to 17 and Luke chapter 20 verses 21 to 25. The reply Jesus gives indicates that Jesus does not agree with the view of the Pharisees. I will speak about this in detail in a separate episode. The traders found ways to hide their true earnings from the Roman officials and thus paid lower taxes. To counter this problem, Rome appointed tax collectors from among the working-class Jews. These tax collectors were paid well, and since they were of the local populace, they knew the tricks used by the traders to hide their earnings. Thus, Rome was able to improve their tax collection. The Pharisees saw this as a challenge to their authority but could do nothing about it, since the tax collectors worked for Rome and were given sufficient authority by Rome to take any necessary action, in case required, to collect the taxes. This raised the status of the tax collectors to a position of power and wealth. Since the tax collectors were basically working-class Jews, the Pharisees were not comfortable with this change in their social status. They therefore categorized the tax collectors as sinners, to dampen the fascination of the working-class Jews towards this trade. The tax collectors thus found themselves ostracized from society and unable to interact with their fellow Jews, other than for purpose of work. Jesus, however, openly associates with the tax collectors. We see in Luke chapter 3 verses 12 to 13 that the teaching of John the Baptist is similar with Jesus' view, as he tells the tax collectors that they would be sinners only if they collected more than what they were authorized to collect.
Even tax collectors came to be baptized, and they asked him, "Teacher, what should we do?" He said to them, "Collect no more than the amount prescribed for you."
In Matthew chapter 9 verses 9 to 13 we read of how Jesus calls the tax collector Matthew and how he addresses the Pharisees, later that evening. The story is repeated in Mark chapter 2 verses 13 to 17 and Luke chapter 5 verses 27 to 32. Let us listen to this now.
As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come to call not the righteous but sinners."
So is Jesus trying to say that the tax collectors are sinners, and the Pharisees are not? The truth is that we are all sinners, and Jesus calls those who accept themselves as sinners and not those who think of themselves as holy. This is the difference between the tax collectors and the Pharisees, and also the reason why Jesus calls the tax collectors and not the Pharisees. So now, it is up to us to decide who we want to emulate, the tax collectors or the Pharisees.
The Samaritans.
Who are the Samaritans and from where did they come from? In John chapter 4 verse 12, the Samaritan woman tells Jesus,
Our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it.
So are the Samaritans, descendants of Jacob as well? Then, why are they not Jews? Again, in John chapter 4 verse 25 the woman speaks of the Messiah, so it seems that the Samaritans also believe in the same things as the Jews. But we also see that it says in John chapter 4 verse 9,
Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans.
So, what exactly is the relation between the Jews and the Samaritans? Let us look at the history of the Jews. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt for a long time. They were ill-treated by the Egyptians, and they cried out to God. God heard them and chose Moses to lead the Israelites back to the Promised Land. After they reached the Promised Land, they continued to live as a community and had no king for about 400 years. Their unity as a community held them together and there were prophets to guide them. If any other country tried to attack or capture them, they fought together and maintained their independence. The Bible tells us that Saul was the first king of Israel. History tells us that Saul became the king of Israel in 1021 BC and ruled for 20 years. He was succeeded by King David, who was succeeded by his son Solomon. However, the Bible tells us that Solomon married foreign wives who brought their own gods with them. Solomon allowed his wives to build temples to their gods in the hills surrounding Israel. Two of these gods were Molech and Baal, who had to be appeased with child sacrifices. The wives of Solomon therefore started preaching their religion to the Israelites and enticing them to sacrifice children to appease these gods. As the Israelites started doing this, God was unhappy and moved away from the Israelites. We see then that the Israelites lose the unity that they had, and Israel is divided into two nations: the larger northern kingdom of Samaria and the smaller southern kingdom of Judah. In 721 BC, Samaria was captured by the Assyrians. They carried away as slaves all the able-bodied citizens of Samaria. Only the old and crippled were left behind. Similarly, in 586 BC, Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, fell to Babylon. The temple was destroyed, and all the bronze vessels and the gold were carried away. We read in 2 Kings chapter 25 that the captain of the guard Nebuzaradan took away as slaves the entire population of Judah, but he left behind some of the poorest of the poor to be vine-dressers and tillers of the soil. The Bible tells us that God allowed Israel to be conquered because they had been unfaithful to him. The exiled children of Israel, and those who were left behind, believed this. The few who were left behind intermingled with the foreigners in the land and had descendants from them. The inhabitants of Samaria had for long not had any instruction in the laws or teachings of the Jewish scriptures. They also had no religious teacher to guide them, but in their eagerness to remain faithful to the God of Abraham and the teachings of the Torah, they taught their foreign wives about the God of Abraham and brought up their children as per the teachings of Moses as best they knew how. In 539 BC, Cyrus, the king of Persia, conquered Babylon. The next year, in 538 BC, he allowed the Israelites to return to their land after being in exile in Babylon for almost 50 years. The Old Testament books of Ezra and Nehemiah speak of this. The first thing the Israelites did on their return was the rebuilding of the temple at Jerusalem. The book of Ezra speaks of the inhabitants of Israel asking for permission to build the temple at Jerusalem along with the returned exiles. However, they were not allowed to do so. They were instead asked to abandon their foreign wives and children if they were to be accepted as Israelites. The reason that was given to them was that God had punished the whole of Israel for the sin that Solomon committed by marrying foreign women. They, therefore, wanted the inhabitants to forsake their foreign wives to be accepted as Israelites or else be treated as non-believers. The ones that did so were accepted back while the others were not. The book of Nehemiah, chapter 13, also speaks of how the men who had children from foreign wives were chased away and not allowed to be part of the community of Israel. These people were called the Samaritans. They could only enter the temple up till the outer court and could offer sacrifice there. The Samaritans therefore built their own temple at Mount Gerizim. which they believe is the site of worship chosen by Moses. Other than this difference of worship, there is no other difference mentioned in the Old Testament between the Jews and the Samaritans. However, by the time of Jesus, this difference had widened to such an extent that the Jews would have nothing to do with the Samaritans. So the Samaritans became outcasts in their own country. The mistake made by Ezra and his fellow Jews was that, in their eagerness to follow the letter of the law, they had broken the spirit of the law. They had created a division among the Jews, and had ultimately created outcasts of those people, who had sincerely, and without the benefit of any teacher or leader, for almost 50 years, tried to remain true to the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. God would probably have considered them better disciples than those who had returned from exile.
Summing it up.
It's easy for us today to find fault with the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, but are we any different? What reasons do we have of putting people down? Do we try to insult or ridicule those who we consider a threat to our own growth or leadership? How do we treat those who we think can become more powerful than us? Are we jealous of those who are doing better than us? How do we treat those who we feel are blessed by birth but do not deserve the benefits they have? Do we treat them differently? Does that not make us hypocrites? Jesus interacted with everyone in the same way, and that is what he expects of us as well. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 verses 17 to 18,
"Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them but to fulfill them. For truly, I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of letter, will pass from the law until all is accomplished."
And indeed Jesus did not come to change the law but rather to teach us the right interpretation of the law. And the law requires that we love unconditionally. We cannot judge one another for our habits and cultures. We cannot judge each other based on the customs we follow or the occupations we have. If we cannot help someone live a better life, we have no right to judge someone for the life they live. Jesus moves freely among the prostitutes. He moves freely among all those who the society had labeled as outcasts, not because he approved of what they did but rather to show us that we are not the ones who are entitled to judge. In John chapter 5 verse 45, Jesus says,
"Do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. Your accuser is Moses, on whom you have set your hope."
He said this because Moses was the one who handed over the commandments of God to us. He will be the one to accuse us if we misinterpret these commands to suit our needs or to ostracize someone from the community, as the Pharisees did. In Matthew chapter 25 verses 31 to 32, Jesus says,
"When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats." So Jesus teaches that it will be Moses or Jesus himself who will judge the nations, not you or I. Why then do we consider it our responsibility now to condemn sections of society? Recently, Pope Francis asked for inclusion of the LGBT community within the Church. A lot of people have hailed this decision, but many have criticized this as well. But is it right to criticize? Are these also not children of the same Father who created us? Do we claim to be more holier than them, that we should say that we have a right within the Church and they do not? When the Pharisees brought to Jesus a woman caught in adultery, Jesus tells them in John chapter 8 verse 7, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." We read further that none of them cast a stone but rather walked away, one by one, beginning with the elders. Today Jesus is asking us the same thing with regards to the LGBT community. How will we respond? This is not to judge whether the LGBT are sinners or not, but rather, to say that we have no right to judge them. Just as Jesus did not judge the woman caught in adultery, we too should not judge any section of society, because by doing so, we claim to be holier than Jesus himself. What does religion mean to us? Is it following a set of rules or is it more than that? Jesus taught us to call God our Father. How do we treat our Father's creation,
which includes people of every race and religion. Jesus taught us that the only rule which is important is the rule of love. We must ask ourselves if this is what we have understood from our religion. If not, then perhaps we have not understood our religion as we should. In these first 2 episodes, we have looked at the various classes of society during the time of Jesus. We have seen how Jesus approached these various classes and also what lessons we should draw in our approach to various people in society. In the next episode we will look at the various women who are spoken about in the genealogy of Jesus and why they are referenced there. In the meantime, feel free to check out my website, understandingthebible.co.in.